The Victoria Cross is perhaps the most celebrated and renowned medal for military valor in the world, bar none. Sure, the Americans have the Purple Heart, the Medal of Honor, but the Victoria Cross, there's something special about it. Just over 1,300 people have ever received a Victoria Cross in its history, 99 Canadians, but no Canadians have received the Canadian version of the Victoria Cross, which came about in 1993. Hello, I'm Brian Lilley. This is the Full Comment Podcast, and today we're going to discuss the whole issue of why nobody's received it and what's being done to rectify that. There's a new series that you'll be seeing in National Post, perhaps you've already seen it, penned by people like our guest today, General Rick Hillier, detailing this oversight or lack of awareness, the need to actually recognize people in our military history and the need to honor them. We're not doing a good enough job of that, and that is why Rick Hillier is joining me now. Rick, thanks for the time.
Oh, Brian, glad to be here this morning.
So I want to talk about all of this. I want to talk about your great piece in the National Post, but you've had a few great pieces in the National Post lately, and you've become very active on social media. And so I want to clear up something before we get into the meat and bones of the Hero Among Us initiative. Are you running for the Conservative Party of Canada? Because that is what everyone is emailing me about every time you have a great post.
Well, first of all, I've been doing a lot of posts, and I've been active on social media, and I've had a couple of things in the National Post and some other parts of our media also. And I've been doing that because I'm a frustrated, somewhat cynical Canadian. I'm worried about what's happening to our country. I'm worried about the fact that inside of Canada, we seem to have pitted every different region, every part of our society against each other. I'm worried about the fact that we have been reduced to irrelevance internationally. That's my view, obviously. And I think a majority of Canadians feel exactly the same way. And the reason I've been somewhat active and more active than before, certainly, is to maybe just inspire some of those and cause some of them to get louder and get that silent majority turned into a noisy, rambunctious majority and actually say enough is enough in this country. We have a wonderful place that we live in, we raise our families in, we work in, we call home, and we want to keep it that way and build it better for the future, for our children, grandchildren, and the next generations of all. That's why I'm doing those things, not because I'm running for any kind of political office.
So you're not running for any particular office, any party at this time. You're just venting your spleen and trying to make things better.
No, I'm not venting my spleen, Brian. I'm trying to make things better by encouraging others to come out and talk also and say, okay, right, we agree. We don't agree with all those things, but we agree with a lot of it. Our country needs some emergency medical first aid, if you will, and we are going to get involved. And I want people to be able to talk to their members of parliament and talk to their members of the provincial assembly and talk to those who want to be members of parliament and make sure that they're helping shape those individuals and making sure that when they vote for somebody, that they're voting for people who have identical views or similar views to what those individuals have. So that's what I'm trying to do. And is there a little bit of venting? Yeah, of course there is.
General, I'd say those were very long answers like a politician would give, but I know you're from Newfoundland and you got a tongue like a Mounties boot and you can talk forever. So I'll put it down to that.
It's a Newfoundland trait.
So and Newfoundland, big contributor to our military. I can't remember being on a base or at a military event where there's not someone from Newfoundland and Labrador there. And that's the tradition you come from. I would say that I come from a military family. My grandfather still got a stepbrother serving up at CFB Petawawa. We were all involved in cadets or reserves or something. There was always an attachment to the military. But that's an anomaly in Canada these days. Let's talk about why you decided to do Heroes Among Us. We don't fund our military properly. We don't honor and look after our veterans properly. And those who do serve, we're not honoring properly with medals. So let's start with the Canadian Victoria Cross. It's been around for 31 years now. Is that right? 1993, and not a single person has ever received it?
Brian, so I'm doing all of those things in part because of what you mentioned. We're not funding our military properly. Canadians don't know those folks. But one of the things that I'm doing with some incredible individuals is trying to tell the stories of those people who have inspired me. and who got me out of bed in the morning when I was wearing a uniform and literally want to go and soldier with them because they were out to change the world. And in particular, these are the incredible heroes among us who give so much and are willing to sacrifice sometimes up to and including their lives, and they ask for almost nothing back. And those are inspirational stories. And these days, you get very few people who give without asking either more back or asking for a lot back. And so because these men and women who wear the uniform, their families who stand beside them during the most stressful of times, because they give so much, they ask for nothing back. They're inspirational in an incredible manner. Canadians don't know about them. And we want to tell those stories. And we started with the National Post. A businessman and philanthropist, Kevin Reed, is a good friend of mine and business colleague, with the National Post and with Historic of Canada to tell those stories, supported by true patriot love, so Canadians can be inspired also, and we can pay tribute to those individuals. And there are so many of them, and Canadians don't know about them. And you can go back in history and talk about them, but we've got so many of them living among us right now that we want to highlight them. We want to inspire Canadians with them and with their stories of service, and we want to make Canada a better place because of that.
You've got a great story of Jess Larell in your piece that went out Friday in the National Post. And I want to ask you about Jess, but I mean, I'd argue that for a long time we haven't done a good job on this. I was part of the honor guard that was there to just, be showpieces. Wasn't a very good soldier, but I was good at drills. So they put me in the honor guard for changing the name of the James Street Armories to the John Weir Foote Armories. John Weir Foote was a chaplain in the Canadian Armed Forces, was at Dieppe. I barely knew anything about his story. We were changing the name of the armory, and we weren't even informed of what was going on and why. We do a bad job of telling our stories. So I appreciate that you're going out of your way to try and fix this by telling the stories of people like Jess Larell. He's one of many that are going to be featured and honored in this series at nationalpost.com and in the print edition. But tell me a little bit about him, because he tragically passed away last August before he could be properly recognized. I understand he got some medals for valor, but not the Canadian Victoria Cross. Give me his backstory, because he sounds like he deserves it.
Well, I think he does. I think a relook at his entire file with the richness of detail that we now have, that is to say, after the action, after these years have gone by, being able to talk to people who were there, talk to his commanding officer who was also involved in that fight, and I believe that maybe we just undershot with Jess Larell by one medal, i.e. Star of Military Valor, versus getting the Victoria Cross. But look, let's just step back to John Weir Foote that you talked about. And how is it that we don't know about this incredible Canadian? From the Durham region, a Padre joined the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. And if you stand on the beaches of Dieppe and just try to visualize a cannon up in each side of those cliffs shooting across that beach, mortar rounds coming in and detonating, wounded and injured soldiers, others, lying in the rocks trying to find cover. And Padre John Foote makes trip after trip to pick up wounded soldiers under fire across that beach, brings them to the shelter of an abandoned landing craft that had obviously could not go back into the water after it landed and got shot up by the Germans, got, 10 or 20 of them into the shelter of that landing craft. And then as the tide started to come in and the landing craft came back in to take the troops off the beach, he started carrying them again under fire from that landing craft to the landing craft coming to take the troops off the beach, got them into the landing craft to send them safely back to England. And the commanding officer, de Riley, said, "Hey, Padre, time to get on board." And John Foote looked at his commanding officer, looked back on the beach where there were hundreds of Canadians who were going to be left there and going to go into prisoner of war camps, and said, "My flock on the beach needs me more than those back in England." He voluntarily went into a prisoner of war camp, was a leader while he was there, kept Canadian spirits up, and came back and was awarded the Victoria Cross. He's buried in Coburg Cemetery. He was a minister in the government of Ontario, continued to serve his nation. No Canadian knows about it. How come we don't teach that in school? How come, Brian, that we don't have a movie made about Padre John Foote or Smokey Smith or Francis Pagamagaba, that great sniper from World War I? Jess Larell, I believe, is in that same category. In October of 2006, he went to Strong Point Center with his platoon, They were down one section. So instead of 3 sections of soldiers, there were 2. The commanding officer was there with what we call his TAC headquarters. And they got hit immediately after they arrived by a significant Taliban attack. The section was shorthanded. Master Corporal Jeremy LeBlanc was the section's second in commander. He said, I got to put somebody up in that tower as an observation tower to give us early warning. We have a rule. You never put one person by themselves in a spot like that, always 2. He said, I don't have enough to put 2 people. Do I have a volunteer to go? Jess stuck his hand up, so volunteered right away to go to the point of the fight, the most dangerous spot. No sooner was he in that mud-walled tower than a rocket-propelled grenade entered the tower and detonated above his head. And Jess said, I was looking up. He said, it looked like Star Wars with all the things that were happening around me. He is slammed by the explosion back into a mud wall that's just like steel. It's been hardened in the desert sun for decades and decades. He goes unconscious, comes back to consciousness very quickly. He's got pain in his back. He's got pain in his ears. His eardrums are broken. He's got pain in his eyes. He's shaky. He doesn't really know what's going on. Then he gets himself back into the fight, and he sees the attack is coming. He opens up with his machine gun, uses all of his ammunition. He had about 800 rounds with him, uses most of that, but saved 100 rounds or thereabouts for that last-ditch defense. And then he started using the M72 rockets, the ones in the cardboard tubes that you throw away, the disposable tube after you fire it. You pick it up, you pop the caps off, you slide it open, you aim, you shoot, you throw it away, you pick up another. And he started doing that one after the other at the individual Taliban fighters who were attacking, broke the back of the attack after several hours. Meanwhile, in his section, we had 2 soldiers that were already killed and others wounded there. The platoon commander came bounding up to head towards the observation post and just make sure we were still good to go. And he said, as I approached and I saw the destruction from that RPG round and other rounds, he said, I said, there's nobody alive in there. And all of a sudden, a little head stuck himself up and said, hey, sure, I'll give you covering fire. Come on in. And it was Jess, of course. And the platoon commander said, okay, I'm going to replace you and we'll get 2 people up here. And Jess said, sir, I know the lay of the land. Don't put somebody else in here right now. I'm good to go. And he stayed there until darkness, got reinforced by his platoon warrant officer for the nighttime. They held that position. The next morning, the fight was over, came out, went back to Kandahar airfield and helped carry the body of his very close friend, Private Williamson, onto the airplane for that last trip home. It was only after that Jess went to one of our combat medics and said, hey, I'm hurting a little bit. And we discovered, he had a broken back. Right? He had vertebrae in his neck broken. His eardrums are busted. The retina in his right eye is detached. And people who've had that talk about how painful that is. He's been concussed. And obviously he was taken out of the fight and began a long trip back to Canada. And then from 2006 to last August, he went on a long journey of I think sometimes botched medical care, misdiagnosed issues, and drugs that really caused his body to wear down. And in August of this past year, sadly, we lost that beautiful young man because of massive organ failure, and we lost an inspirational Canadian. This guy was just an unassuming, quiet individual. He loved having campfires. He loved sitting by the fire, talking with his friends and family. He loved having the cold beer. I went up to North Bay during COVID. I had the opportunity to meet with him and let him tell his story, because he's not boasting about anything. He just says, hey, I was here, we did that. I couldn't have done it without my battle buddies. And yet he did all of those things. We awarded as a nation Jess the Star of Military Valor. I was the chair of the Canadian Forces Honors and Awards Committee at that time. I remember talking to his commanding officer and say, we were that close to a VC recommendation for Jess. And we elected to go with Star of Military Valor. And in hindsight, I regret that. We were new to the game of war and valor and the various levels of it. I said one time, we were kind of like the French figure skating judge at the Olympics. We were saving our marks for something more valorous, more courageous came across us, came across our committee to honor and to recognize. And I believe we made a mistake with Jess. And I think what would be a good thing to do is have some kind of independent commission review the military honors and awards as we see fit and just confirm, yes, it's right, or B, no, it should be either upgraded or changed. And I think if you looked at Jess Larell's file and his citation, and again, the richness of detail, I think the decision would be pretty clear to upgrade him to the Victoria Cross. Regardless, his story needs to be told. Canadians get inspired by it.
One of the things that you write in your piece about the heroes among us in National Post is that when you look at the description of what Jess Larell did, it's similar to others who were awarded the Victoria Cross in previous eras.
It is. It's valor in the presence of the enemy. By himself, volunteering first, by himself into the fight, wounded right at the start of that fight, gets back into the fight and effectively saves that position and supports his platoon and supports the troops that are there fighting for Canada, doing what we asked them to do. And then only after the fight is over and things are stabilized does he take himself to the medic and say, I'm hurting here. And hurting here was an understatement that was extraordinary. And yeah, I do think it's right up there. I do think it's valorous. I do think it's valor in the presence of the enemy, which is really the basic criteria for the Victoria Cross. And I'd love to see Jess's actions relooked by some kind of independent council, independent review. And I think that would be a wonderful thing. And I'd be confident that they would reassess his award and they would upgrade it to the Victoria Cross. But you know something? Even if they reassessed it and said, no, it's appropriate at the Star of Military Valor, I still would be satisfied that we as a nation have the ability to actually relook those things, because right now we don't.
And as you said, to tell his story, I know that you were in Afghanistan. Were you there at the same time as Jess or a bit later?
Yeah, no, I was in and out of Afghanistan, Brian, multiple times, and particularly in 2000, not just particularly in 2006, but yes, in 2006, when the 1 RCR, the 1 Royal Canadian Regiment Battalion Battle Group from Petawawa was the force on the ground, of which Jess was a part. The commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Homer Lavoie, who was also at the fight and who supports an independent review for Jess to see if he warrants the Victoria Cross. And so I was there during that time frame. I don't recall specifically meeting Jess then. Met him a bunch of times since. We invited him to Rideau Hall in, I think it was the spring of 2007. And he showed up at Rideau Hall at what we called a Heroes Ball, Heroes Gala. He showed up in dress uniform, looking so good and looking so young. Oh, my Lord. And Paolo Accolini from the Vancouver Canucks, one of the owners of the Vancouver Canucks, was with me. And he came over. It was when Ottawa was in the finals here against Anaheim. He came over and said, hey, General Hillier, I got some tickets here for the game tomorrow night, Saturday night. He said, I'd like to pass them to you. I said, look, I don't want those tickets. Thank you very much. But I know just a guy that you could maybe make his day. And I called Jess over. I said, this guy wants to talk to you, and introduced them. And he gave them to Jess and said, I hope you enjoy it. And after Jess came back to me and he said, sir, he said, I've never been to an NHL game. You think these are good tickets? I said, Jess, this is one of the owners of a National Hockey League club. I think they're pretty good tickets indeed. And he went off to the game with his then girlfriend and enjoyed it immensely. I talked to him after about that. And yeah,
the joy that you can bring to people with small gestures like that. It's so wonderful.
And Paolo Accolini did that night. It was awesome.
And I was at that point probably one of the reporters outside covering all the antics going on at the arena. So tell me a little bit more, and then we're going to take a break. Tell me a little bit more about the people that you're going to be profiling over the coming weeks. Because as you say, this is a partnership. It's yourself, it's Kevin Reed, it's Historica, it's National Post and Postmedia, it's the True Patriot Love Foundation. And we're kind of the publishing vehicle for this. So this podcast, series of stories. How many people are you looking to profile over the next little while? How many stories are there to tell? I'm guessing there's plenty, but there's more than just Jess Larell that you think should be considered for a Victoria Cross.
Brian, I hope we're going to tell hundreds of stories. But we're going to start with 8 to 10 of current members of our society, minus Jess, of course, who we talk about posthumously. And we talk about Pat Towers, and we'll talk about Willie McDonald and Bill Fletcher and heroes like that over the next 8 to 10 weeks. And then I hope that if this is successful and Canadians are inspired and Canadians want to read about those heroes in that very, very readable fashion, if that's the way to describe it, as the first stories are out there. And the story that was online yesterday in the National Post, if you don't get us out of here, we're all going to die. Oh, my goodness, that resonated with so many Canadians, including so many veterans who came back and said, yes, 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 we were there. We were a part of different things, but something like that. And what a great story. And I hope that what we're going to do, Brian, is tell the stories of those who've won the Star of Military Valor, who've been recognized by our country with that second highest military award. Some stories of people who have been recognized with the Medal of Military Valor, that second highest award, and then maybe start stepping back in history and tell the stories of Padre John Foote, who just continues to inspire me because of his service and his sacrifice, his servant leadership, if you will. Sergeant Tommy Prince, who was part of the Devil's Brigade. And this guy was a one-man wrecking machine all by himself. Francis Bagamaga, who I mentioned.
I can't believe that we don't tell the story of the Devil's Brigade quite enough.
Absolutely. I mean, there's one horrible movie out there, and that's about it right now. And when you go back and look at what occurred, and I had the privilege, a little earlier in my life in military, to meet RSM Levesque in Petawawa, and he came in to be the first formation sergeant major of the Special Service Force, which was formed in Petawawa way back in the late 70s. And he had been in the Devil's Brigade. And oh my goodness, the aura around that guy when he was out doing his morning, I think he was 52 years old or something, 53, and he'd be out on a morning run doing 5 miles with his rucksack on, and all of us young pups, looking around and said, well, if that guy can do it, hey, we're going to be there too. And we want to tell the stories of those individuals. And I mentioned Francis Bagamaga, an incredible Canadian sniper, wounded a variety of times in World War I, gassed at the Second Battle of Ypres, and when the Canadian division was attacked by the Germans using chlorine gas, so badly that for the rest of his life, he had to sleep sitting up. Otherwise, he would have drowned. He was credited, I think, with 476 kills. Can you imagine that? A sniper crawling out into no man's land, settling in there for hours, sometimes several days, and getting that shot and taking out a leader on the other side and improving the odds. And what's most incredible about him, beyond all of those incredible things, is that his first battle was to join the Canadian Army to be able to fight for Canada because he was Indigenous and the Canadians weren't recognized as full citizens. And he fought to join the Army, was one of a very few number. I think number was 26 in World War I. And what a difference he made. We need to tell all of those stories because they're so incredibly fascinating and, to me, inspiring. Let me finish with one more. Andrew Minarski, that officer in the Air Force on a bombing run in 1944, and they get shot down. The Lancaster gets shot down. They're going down in flames, and he goes to jump out, and he sees that his friend, Boyd, his last name, who was in the tail gunner's cupola, trapped, can't get out. He goes back to help him with his bare hands, can't get can't get him free. His flight suit is on fire. His parachute is starting to burn. He gets a fire axe and still continues and cannot get him out. Boyd says, get out, save yourself. Minarski stood up, saluted him, bailed out through the belly hatch. And when he landed, he was, of course, badly injured because of the flames and the landing because his parachute was partly burnt. He died a day or so later.
Oh, wow.
Boyd actually survived the crash of the Lancaster and went into a prisoner of war camp for a year and a half. Finally came back to Canada, and over 1946 and 47 was telling this incredible story about what Minarski had tried to do and his courage and his valor. And finally, I think it was 1947, Andrew Minarski was awarded posthumously, of course, the Victoria Cross. We have his Victoria Cross. And when we do our gala reception at the Hockey Hall of Fame, we're going to have his Victoria Cross there. We're also going to have that fire axe. And kind of sends a little tingle down my spine when I think about that, when I say that, because there's our history right there. Who couldn't be inspired by a young man out of Winnipeg who would do such a thing to save his friend and paid for it with his life? A heroic Canadian, we need to be inspired by him.
Well, the Trudeau government is promising to increase defense spending, but it's not something that's going to happen very quickly. In the meantime, we're getting some heavy criticism south of the border. U.S. Senate Leader Mitch McConnell on the floor just days ago.
Now, there's still work to be done. Not every ally is taking its treaty obligations seriously enough. And one of the most continuing concerning laggards isn't even a European country, but it's our neighbor to the north. Like America, Canada is at once an Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic nation. And it's time for Ottawa to take its obligations to NATO, to NORAD, and to its own defense more seriously.
So, General, fair criticism? We're laggards when it comes to NATO. We're laggards when it comes to defense spending, NORAD, all of that.
Brian, fair criticism. We have been for a long time. We are now more than we were before, if that is possible. Our allies have largely lost faith in us. We are considered now, I've said this before, I believe it, we are irrelevant to what happens on the international scene. And I think that's incredibly dangerous for Canada. First of all, we get dismissed in Washington. And as every Canadian knows, everything in our country is related somewhat to our relationship with our great neighbor to the south, whether it's our economy, whether it's human rights, or whether it's a legal system, or whether it's immigration, or whether it is defense and security. And we depend on having a credibility with that great neighbor, and we are losing that if we've not already lost it completely here. For the rest of NATO, Canada, we're not even considered anymore. And that's dangerous because we don't get a chance, therefore, to shape the international environment in a way that supports what Canada's interests are and what Canada's values are. And other people are going to shape the environment, and we're going to be left on the sideline looking in and then complaining about what occurs. We are laggards on defense. And, we've been considered, and I use it's a harsh word, we've been considered a parasite on defense for years right now. And I know that the defense policy update is very aspirational. I'm being very kind here, very aspirational. Says we're going to get to 1.76 or something like this in the years out. And there are a lot of people who've been analyzing that, and they cannot get to those percentages and numbers. So the belief is that it's worse than what has actually been articulated.
Okay, let me jump to that in a minute. You mentioned being irrelevant. We've always been a bit underfunded, a bit we don't have the same level of equipment as many of our allies. But the claim was always that when the Canadians showed up, if they didn't have the equipment, they had better training. They were able to do more with less. And I think that we are so underfunded, I'm not sure that that's true anymore. And that's not an insult to those who are serving now. We just don't have the capabilities we used to. We're outsourcing our fighter pilot training. You're going to have to go to Finland or Italy or Texas if you want to be a fighter pilot in this country now. It's unbelievable how much we have undervalued and undermined the capabilities of the armed forces.
And Brian, we've lost capabilities. And I look at particularly at my greatest concern. I look particularly at the Army. And even if you think that the defense policy update was a good thing moving forward and we're going to implement it, and obviously the funding and the support for it is so far out there that this government certainly is not going to implement it. And whatever government is next after that might implement some of it, but more likely it's going to change as we go down the line here. It's very aspirational for the Navy of what the Navy is going to get. And the cost is humongous going out there. But we're a long ways away from having new surface combatants, being able to sail and be part of our international alliances and NATO specifically, and do Canadian security on our oceans. We're a long ways from having the F-35 as the fighter that we need to be part of NORAD and part of those international
alliances. We should
alliances.
Be flying the F-35 already.
But they are coming. It's just a timing. My greatest.
Oh, I know, but we delayed for 8 years. We should have had
delayed
them
more than 8
in
years.
2016.
We delayed more than 8 years, Brian. And as I came in to be chief of defense staff, Canada had made an agreement that we were going to have the F-35, and we had committed to develop it so we could participate in support to that entire fleet around the world. And Canadian business would have this awesome opportunity, and then we backed out of all those things. And so we could have had that aircraft, contracted and purchased and starting to come in service, 6 to 10 years ago, quite frankly, when the first ones were coming off the line. My point on the Navy and the Air Force is if this defense policy update longer term gets implemented in any way, shape, or form with more money than is allocated there right now, a lot more, the Navy and the Air Force are heading in a good direction. And they got many challenges, including people. What really concerns me is the Army. 3.5% of the monies, I think it was $75 billion, in that defense policy updated, articulated, 3.5% was coming towards the Army. And the Army is essentially broken. Their equipment is broken. The numbers of troops that they've got are way, way down. The leadership is leaving. Like there are so many people leaving, particularly folks who have been commanding officers of combat units and combat service support units and combat support units. And those are the people who become the senior leaders just a couple years down the road after. They're leaving, and you see the numbers going out the door. It's quite incredible. And you see words like, we're going to look at options for replacing the tank, options for replacing the artillery, options for anti-air defense systems, and options. We went and we said last May, Government of Canada, we're going to help Ukraine, and we're going to do it by giving them an air defense battery, the NASAMS battery, and it's going to cost almost $500 million. They are very expensive. And we're going to do it. So we had government announcement, we had policy in place, we had the dollars there, and we know we have a waiting line. The contract might be signed by now, but it sure wasn't a month ago. And yet we can't go and do the same for the Canadian Forces. We've got to say we're going to look at options to replace all the things that we need replaced. I worry about the Army. I think the Army is as close to being broken completely as you can get and not be broken. And I really worry about the missions coming forward, because when you put troops on the ground, all of a sudden you lose the ability to protect them if they don't go in with the right equipment. We learned those lessons in Afghanistan. They're painful lessons learned. I just give you the example of the helicopters. We did not have the helicopters to deploy. We got them finally. Compliments of the United States of America, who were wonderful to help us out there. But we went on the assumption that our allies would bring the helicopters, and yes, they did. And when push came to shove, guess who got the use of those helicopters first, second, and third? It was the folks who brought them. And we were left languishing because we didn't come with the right kit. We can't continue to ignore lessons like that. We got to go with the places when we go with the right equipment to support our troops when they go there to do the job, because they'll go. They're awesome Canadians.
Should we be changing the way we do defense procurement? Fancy word for buying stuff for the military. There's long been a problem of things taking too long, cost overruns. And I think of 2006. I think it was 2006. I don't think it went into 2007. We were in Afghanistan. The Harper Conservatives had just taken over government. We needed heavy lift planes. They just went and bought straight off the line. Boeing graciously, and the American military graciously said, yeah, you can jump the queue. But we didn't say, oh, well, we need to Canadianize this. Oh, we need to find a way to make sure that there's industrial benefits for every single province in the country, which is what we far too often do. Our allies are all operating great kit, and then we spend years talking about ways to make sure that a plant in Flin Flon gets a cut of the action, or that we've Canadianized the equipment somehow, which is a minor thing. Shouldn't we just be saying, let's buy the best equipment we can at the best price, buy the same stuff our allies are using?
Yes. I go back to 05, 06, 07. Obviously, I was right in the middle of all of that.
You were CDS at the time, weren't you?
I was, and we were driving that hard. And let me just tell you what the key to success was. The key to success was two governments back to back. Paul Martin's Liberal government, followed by Stephen Harper's Conservative government. First a minority government, but he acted like a majority government. Governments who were in support. And we went to cabinet. And then secondly, we had a deputy minister in defense, Ward Elcock, who was the finest public servant I think I've ever met, who was so crucial to getting things through that bureaucratic system that Ottawa has that likes to stop things and tie it in a Gordian knot. We went to cabinet with things, and even Prime Minister Harper said to myself and Ward Elcock before we went into the cabinet room, you got 5 asks. It was the Chinook helicopter, the C-17 transport airplane, the C-130J transport, the Chinook helicopter, and I can't remember if it was the tanks or the trucks. And he said, too much. He said, I think you may get one with support from cabinet. We went into cabinet. We walked out of cabinet with all 5 projects supported. And 6 months later, we had C-17s landing at an air show in Abbotsford, BC, flown by a Canadian crew. And 3 days later, they were on a mission to help an island in the Caribbean that had been hammered by a hurricane. And we were there. It was quite incredible. What you need is the support of a government. The procurement system is simple. If a prime minister says to his cabinet, we need to rebuild the Canadian Forces, and that includes equipment, obviously. And I want, a lead. You got procurement and industry, Canada, and defense. Put the defense minister in the lead. The 3 of you work together. Report to me every month. and I want to see progress made. And I don't want a 10-year procurement cycle. I want a 2-year or less procurement cycle, and let's get it done, and let's get it done so that Canada can be better and be stronger. And the last thing I'd say to the Minister of Defence, because I know I talked to Bill Blair, and I'm not telling tales out of school. I know he's very frustrated with some of the bureaucracy, that he gets tangled in himself, and frustrated that contracts don't get done better and more quickly. Hey, fire some people. Fire some people. We got people that are turning things into knots and slowing it down because they're afraid of the risk involved, perhaps personally to them, for their careers or somebody, I don't know. But fire some people and send a message, this has to get done. I give credit to Bill Blair. I chat to Bill. I've known him a long time. I respect him. He got that P-8 through cabinet. And the P-8, the surveillance aircraft going to replace our P-3s. And he successfully fought off that ludicrous approach by Bombardier to try and make a product in Canada which was not ready, which was not going to meet the capability, in my view, and which would have been absolutely wrong. He drove it through to get the P-8 because that's what the Canadian forces need, and that's what Canada needs. I give him full credit for having done that.
Let's talk about the problems with recruitment and retention in the military. And I'm not going to, just ask you to crap on the military for the next 10, 15 minutes, but I do want to ask you about this because recruitment has long been a struggle, but it's gotten worse. And retired Lieutenant General Michel Maisonneuve, who's written a nice piece in National Post saying that you're right on a bunch of other stuff, he was giving a speech a while ago, and he's been on the podcast talking about how woke culture infecting the military doesn't help with recruitment. Is that part of what's going on? Saying to guys, hey, come and fight for your country. No, we don't have equipment for you, but we've got some nice man ponds here for you. Is that part of the issue that's going on with recruitment, that it kind of undermines the military ethos?
Well, I think there are a lot of things ongoing, and is that one of them? Absolutely. And I'm a firm believer, warriors, not woke. That's what we need, warriors, not woke. And so people are not attracted to the Canadian Forces by any of the changes that have been occurring. Yes, I am 100% supportive of leaders building an inclusive environment. And that, so I don't care which part of our society we come from in Canada, I can feel comfortable in the Canadian Forces because my home is going to be there and I can serve my nation. But there are a lot of, also, again, bureaucratic obstacles to what's going on. The fact that you apply for to go into a reserve unit or the regular force, and it's months before you hear back from the recruiters. And then your application takes months to work its way through. And by then, most people have lost hope, they've lost faith, they've lost interest, and they're gone elsewhere. And there are stories that abound out there. We went through this in 2005, 2006, 2007. And I called the recruiting team in, and we sat down and walked through this. And there was Major General, then Lieutenant General Walt Semyonov, Lieutenant Colonel Bernie DeReeve down in recruiting, and they changed the system. And I gave them a challenge: we want 70% of people that you see come in front of your recruiters. And oh, by the way, don't sit in your recruiting center waiting for people to come to you. You go to where people are, and that's what we started doing. I want 70% of them that are enrolled conditionally within the first 7 days. 15 minutes after you start talking to somebody, whether or not you're interested, presupposing what they have said and what they tell you on their application is true. Whether you're interested in them as a soldier or not. Out of the remaining 30%, take 80% of that and say, okay, we'll give you a month to enroll them. There may be some things that you have to verify. And if you get a red flag that goes up on the remainder, take your time with them. If you remember that horrible man who killed the 14 women in Quebec and that terrible, terrible tragedy, we had refused him entry into the Canadian Forces because a red flag went up. We don't want to miss those. And we said we can change that, and we changed our recruiting. I kept stretching the goals for that team. We went, 100%, want 100% of the number we need, which is, let's say, 5,000. Then I said, we want 115% because we're going to grow the forces. And we did it. We can still do it right now. People are not being attracted, though, when you get the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance on TV saying, the Canadian Forces just don't get it. They don't understand over there. You're beating up on your own armed forces, which happened.
Well, there was that publication. It's an official publication of the Canadian Armed Forces. It's filled with academics. Came out with an entire issue recently. I forget the name of it. saying that the Canadian Armed Forces is filled with toxic masculinity and is a tool of white supremacy. Okay, you've just told all your soldiers that they're the worst people on the planet. Now, stick around a bit longer. Tell your friends to sign up. That's not going to work.
Any leader knows that the way to not be successful is to berate and beat your people and tell them they're not useful, not good, and they're not what you want. And you're going to fail for sure when you do that kind of thing. And that's why people leave. That's why retention is the most efficient way to keep your armed forces capable. Because just think of how much you have to invest to train people, train somebody to be an F-18 pilot, train somebody to drive a ship, train somebody to operate that anti-tank missile system once we get one from Israel, by the way, which is where we've ordered them. And so, yeah, it's challenging. But I'll also just quote one of our former Air Force commanders who said, our best recruiting tool are a bunch of new airplanes on the flight line. And when you have old equipment and you have no expectation of replacing that equipment in the short term, why would you join? Who wants to join and be part of an organization that's obviously in the outer realms of value in Canadian society, or at least in the eyes of the government of Canada, in their view? And so, yeah, it's challenging right now. It is challenging right now. Here's the good thing. People still want to join. They still want to join. If we could sort out the recruiting system, people still want to serve their country. People are in uniform, do want to stay if they can see that there's value in it, and they do want to continue to serve their country. I talk to so many of them at so many places across Canada as I travel, and they're not seeing the incentive to stay.
Let me ask you about your other piece in National Post recently. I feel like this whole thing's an ad for National Post. I mean, it's Postmedia podcast, but I keep mentioning great columns in the National Post. Rob Roberts, I think he owes me a dinner or something for all this. So you had a piece, I believe the headline was something to the effect of that right now we've got ideology masking as leadership. And there was one part that jumped out at me where you talked about how we couldn't even come together. Governments could not come together during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I talked to you a bit during that time. You were hired by the Ford government here in Ontario to manage the logistics of the rollout of the COVID vaccine. There were times when different levels of government, and you're in the middle of this, and the vaccine's having a bumpy rollout, but there were times when it was not arguments over how fast the vaccine was coming or how well it was being distributed. There were purely partisan shots being taken over something that people were very concerned about, that they felt was a life and death matter. And here people are playing politics. That must have really pissed you off.
Well, it was about that time. So yes, it did. Yes, it did. It was a stressful enough time frame, a difficult enough time frame for all Canadians that actually we didn't need to add the gasoline to that fire by the partisan politics that were being played. And look here, I have to give credit to Doug Ford. And just one example. I went to him and I saw him every single day. And I went to him one day and said, hey, I hear there are 10 million shots of vaccine available in Illinois because the Americans can't get them in fast enough. And while I'm there in the office, we pick up the phone, we phone the head of Pfizer, and Premier Ford said to him, look, I'll have a plane there to pick them up by tomorrow morning. And we go, no, we can't do that. The president won't let them be exported, et cetera. But he was willing to do anything to protect the people of Ontario. And he had my back trying to do this. That's when I first made the comment about we missed a golden opportunity in my view. We missed a golden opportunity during our darkest hour to have actually come together and eliminated, to the extent possible, partisan politics. We should have formed a war cabinet, just like Churchill did in May of 1940 with the invasion of the Nazis and the destruction of France. Just as we got invaded by that horrible enemy called the COVID virus, we could have formed a war cabinet of the parties, brought them together with a 2-year agreement and said, hey, we're going to fight this enemy and we're going to do it in a nonpartisan manner for the benefit of Canadians. And that would have removed 80 to 90% of the partisan politics that we got caught in. Second thing we said, we're going to follow the science and we're going to do that so we have a solid base on which to make our decisions. And we didn't across the country. I mean, we had decisions being made because of partisan politics and shots being fired, so to speak, that were certainly not based on science. And I think we missed a golden opportunity to show our country what we could do if we come together as Canadians, throw out the partisan politics. We didn't do it.
In terms of dividing the country, what do you see are the biggest divisions that are being, I don't want to say that politicians are creating the divisions, but they seem to be, like you stick a knife in an oyster and you wiggle it about to open it up. Feels like they're doing that.
Well, it does. And I don't think there's any one single thing that I see that is the big division, division in our country or the big divide. Sometimes it's the death of 1,000 cuts, more than one big sort of swipe with a sword that causes a body to fall over because it can't take it anymore. And I think that's what I see right now. And across the country, I just worry, we're putting the Maritimes against the rest of Canada because of the carbon tax abatement. And we're putting, Quebec against the rest of Canada, and Alberta and Saskatchewan against the rest of Canada, and BC out there on its own looking another way. And Ontario, the driving economic engine of our country, sort of looking to itself because it feels that it has to. And then within society, look at what's happened recently since 7 October and the horrible barbarity that occurred in Israel, and what's happened with the protests across our nation. And so many Canadians, again, if you will, that silent majority, feeling that we have not responded well. We have not come out on the side of what is right and good. And why are we frightening 300,000 Canadians or more in Canada, not because they're bombing Gaza, but because they're Jews? And why are we permitting that to occur? We're pitting every part of our society by not taking actions against each other. And I think that is horrible. And I do think death by 1,000 cuts is far worse and more difficult to reverse than one big sort of stab wound, if you will.
Well, General Hillier, it's been a pleasure talking to you once again, as always. And I got to say, I'm enjoying the re-engaged General Rick Hillier. I want to see more of you on social media and in the pages of our newspapers and online. It's fun.
Brian, it is. But look, I'm a proud Canadian. I love my country. I love wearing the flag on my left shoulder for all of those years. All I ever wanted to be was a Canadian soldier, and I got to live my dream. I was proud of Canada in certain moments. In 2006, 2007, I'd go to the NATO Chief of Staff meetings, and when Canada spoke around that table, NATO listened. Now, not so much. And I was proud of all of those things that occurred, and proud of what we did in World War I, and certainly proud of what we did in World War II, proud of so many of our leaders. Mackenzie King, probably the greatest influencer in the history of the world, because he influenced Franklin Roosevelt in a way that nobody knows about. And he influenced Winston Churchill, perhaps to a lesser degree. But the guy who won World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, Mackenzie King influenced him to the benefit of our nation. And I was proud of all those things. I want to be proud going forward to the future. And that's why I'm mouthing off a lot about those things.
Continue to mouth off, General Hillier. Continue, and we'll chat again soon. Thanks so much for the time.
Thanks, Brian.
Full Comment is a Postmedia podcast. My name's Brian Lilley, your host. The episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer of Full Comment. You can subscribe to us, and please do hit the subscribe button on Apple Podcasts, on YouTube Podcasts, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast. Leave us a review, a recommendation, a rating, and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilley.